Longtime friend, Baker Shogry. Baker and I actually attended undergrad together and share a little bit of professional background in that our first working experience was commercial salmon fishing in Alaska. So Baker, tell me, you're now head of product at Plaid. What's the story there? Connect the dots.
It's just, so when you commercial salmon fishing, you get a lot of free food. And so I just followed the free food train through my career to places like Plaid. Now, so I started out my career after salmon fishing in management consulting. So nothing.
Classic transition.
Yeah, really spicy. But that exposed me to a lot. One of the things it exposed me to was to private equity and investing, and I ended up taking a role in investing in technology. And so that's what brought me out to San Francisco. I worked for a firm called Silver Lake in their middle market and growth fund. So I was working with companies that were anywhere from 50 people to 200 people, trying to grow, hoping to IPO in a few years, and helping them think about business problems and helping them with capital. And that's where I got exposed to product, working with a lot of product founders, working with people on our team that had formerly come from product positions, and just was fascinated by the process of building technology, the technology itself.
I think you also had a little stint where you learned to code and got
and that's what led to that. Yeah, so coming out of that role, I ended up taking a little bit of computer science, enough to build my own applications, learned very humbling lessons trying to actually get those off the ground and maybe build a business around them. But really enjoyed the process, loved the craft. And then in the middle of all that, actually was back in San Francisco having a conversation with Zach where he mentioned that Plaid all of a sudden had revenue and had a business to talk about. And the last time I think we had talked is when I gave him my American Express credentials for one of those PFM apps, and nothing terrible happened, so the downside was kind of established from a personal perspective. But there was an opportunity for just somebody who had spare hands and could think about business things to actually add some value for, I think, the first time in Plaid's history at that point. It was basically founders, engineers, people in the product only.
You joined as Plaid's basically first business person, and then that kind of morphed into first. First a business person, and then that morphed into kind of the first product person. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, because there are a lot of people who are out here starting their own companies or thinking about that. Talk to me about just the evolution and the growth of the product organization through your lens.
Yeah. So when I joined, we didn't have a product organization. We didn't need one, really. We had the founders, Zach and William, very product-minded product founders, all of the engineers, all of the designers.
And you have a technical product as well with developers as the customers.
Easier to access our customers, get lots of very intimate feedback from them, and everybody was managing the product together. And so I was doing things very differently just from an operational perspective, but got to know the product and was technical enough to have empathy with the customers and understand how it worked. And then we actually had a moment at the company where we had a very short amount of time to do a very complex series of things that impacted the products and impacted our vendors and things like that.
Give me a little flavor of what sorts of things those were.
Yeah, we had a partnership with Intuit very early on, who used to have a product that actually functioned like Plaid's, and so we had a partnership with them that they, right after we got a lot of customers who were really getting a lot of value and depending on it, they decided to shut the product down and gave us, consequently, a very short amount of time to find a replacement or build our own. And so for us, that meant managing all sorts of efforts across the company to sort of bring together how we were going to build our own product. It actually, I think, it made us move a lot faster towards something that we absolutely had to do and was really critical that we did for the future. But in the beginning, it was just somebody who wasn't an engineer, who wasn't a designer, who was able to work with the engineer team, designer team, the rest of our customers and go-to-market folks, just to try to get a handle on things. So it really started out more as project management, and then over time has sort of traveled along that invisible spectrum to something that feels closer to, but isn't, general management, but is more of a all-around business thinker and embedded entrepreneur on the team is sort of the model that we hope for folks.
Awesome, that's great. And from those days of replacing what Intuit built to now you guys, I think, just published your kind of highlights of what you built out over 2019, did a lot of different things. You released liabilities, made improvements to like your auth product. I'd love to hear some of the more recent kind of things you guys have improved on.
Yeah, there's kind of two dimensions of how we're trying to like grow the product, and definitely over the last year, this is true. There's one which is just sort of expanding along the axis of access to data. So you think about Plaid's core value proposition from the very beginning as an infrastructure company. It's how do we enable consumers to permission their data to the applications and services that they want to use. And so in the beginning, that was focused on credit cards and depository accounts, and focused on transactions and account information about those. And then over time, for those same accounts, we added identity information. We then started to think about different types of accounts. So adding investment accounts includes other institutions, adding liabilities data. You can think about us sort of filling out this 360-degree view of someone's financial life and enabling them to transport all of that information. And then thinking about geographical expansion. So similar value proposition, but doing that not just in the US and Canada, but then in Europe, which is a main focus of last year. And so that's one dimension. The other dimension is then thinking about how do we actually add more and more value or do more and more sophisticated things on top of that access to data. So in some cases, that just means better enhancing transactions data or giving developers more insight into the accounts that consumers are permissioning so they can help them more effectively. Trying to actually tap into the power of the Plaid network as it exists today. So just by virtue of providing access to data, what we've ended up with is one of the largest connected financial networks in the world. When you think of the number of accounts that consumers have actually connected to applications through Plaid, and that actually allows us to start tackling really entrenched, really sticky problems in financial services because we have these existing relationships with consumers and we can build trust with them over time because we can see what looks like normal and then detect what looks like abnormal for a given consumer and help protect them against fraud. And so when we think about if you try to boil down a lot of really sticky problems in financial services, a lot of times you'll realize it comes down to information asymmetry, right? And that's why a transaction is expensive. It's why a loan is expensive. And when you think about what Plaid enables is a lot more transparency on either side of any of these financial relationships or transactions. And so that will hopefully give us an edge to try to untie some of these really tricky knots.
And now you guys have more transparency through your APIs into the investments and the liabilities side of a consumer's financial life. So I'd love to hear you talk about some of the things that you've seen Plaid customers do now that they have this new capability unlocked.
Yeah. So there's a lot. So investments is new to the Plaid API, but we joined with we acquired a company called Quovo, which was honestly probably one of the biggest highlights of last year in terms of those two teams coming together. And one of the product highlights of that was being able to offer investment data on the Plaid platform. And that manifests itself in a lot of different ways, right? In some ways, it's enabling portability like we do with depository accounts. So working on how do you make it easier to move assets from one brokerage to another so that you can actually get the best product, the best advice, service that you need. And others it's just general financial management. But for a lot of customers at Plaid who have just been helping you with cash flow, right, actually being able to help you with assets and liabilities is a really potentially interesting roadmap for people to start walking down to help people make better decisions and, like Zach talked about, hopefully even automate some of them. And on the liability side, we started out with student loans as the first sort of liability.
There are definitely a lot more people working on student loans now, which is
exciting.
Yeah,
and so that's the hope. I mean, Zach kind of mentioned this, but what's I think is exciting about Plaid is we're working on a very, and fintech in general, right? And I think like what everyone here should and is excited about is that money is a huge problem for people in their lives, right? And when you survey them, it's always one of the top two, it's health or money, and it's usually the top one because it has a tendency to cause a lot of other issues in people's lives. And it's such a big problem, and people's situations are so varied and diverse that any one company trying to solve it all themselves is going to have a very hard time, trying to move the needle overall. And that's also not a very good way to think about it. What we need is a vast ecosystem, a constellation of different companies, different teams, building different products, and trying to push expectations forward for consumers across the board. And so if we can build products like liabilities or like investments or like anything that's on our roadmap that make it easier for people to go out and build these products and tackle these problems, we get to have this levered impact where we get to think about the people that we're helping build aren't just our team that works at Plaid, but it's the thousands of our people that work all across our customers.
Absolutely, and so now you have a much more complete view of consumer financial lives here. But as you've expanded to Europe too, you're also touching the lives of more consumers. What is it like to take the technology that you've built here, and what are some of the similarities, but also differences from a regulatory and infrastructure, a consumer behavior, a fintech ecosystem, and like what are some of those differences and learnings as you look at expanding?
Yeah, how many folks are familiar with fintech in Europe? Like reasonably. Okay, yeah.
We have a very sophisticated
group. I know, that's great. It's a great meetup. So it's been, Europe is very different from the US in a lot of different ways. I think there are a couple of realizations early on that, for I think people familiar with Europe are like, you might say duh, but for people that were just trying to get a grip on it in the first place was very illuminating. I mean, for one, just understanding that Europe is not a single market. It's a collection of very different markets. There are similar needs, but very different expectations from consumers across them. You think about credit card penetration in Germany is something like 20%, or maybe 40%, and in Britain it's 200%. And so if you're trying to develop a single, for example, personal financial management app to give advice to people in Germany and people in Britain, their situations or expectations just can be fundamentally different. And so realizing that was a big first step. With that in mind, and then kind of the humbling of, well, we don't just want to show up as the Americans with some products and say, well, here, aren't you glad we've arrived? We tried to focus on consistent use cases, like what is the value that we're trying to provide for our customers, and not think about consistent implementations. So instead of trying to take our product and say, okay, how do we make it work in Europe? We say, okay, we solved this problem for our customers in the US. How do we solve that same problem for our customers in Europe, even if it means building a product that looks or feels very differently? And that way we can have kind of the same conversation with a customer across borders. We can talk about the good that we're doing. We can understand the problem from a product perspective very consistently. And we tend to build product that isn't localized, but rather is local from the beginning. And so the hope there too is that ultimately we'll end up importing as much product from Europe to the US because we're building new things there as we will import from the US to Europe. And so we create...
You have an opportunity as a developer platform to also allow developers to exchange ideas about how to build and create applications too.
Yeah,
so that's cool.
Exactly.
Cool, and I want to touch on one more thing too, which is give me a little bit of a flavor for the, what's ahead for Plaid from a product perspective. What's next that you're excited about?
Yeah, so Zach touched on a few of these. We'll continue the sort of strategy I talked about in terms of more access to data, whether that's new geographies. So thinking about where are the next places in the world where there's latent demand of populations that are banked or ready to be banked.
I've definitely seen more Plaids for X's as well. So given the news, more people are wanting to copy what you're doing. But there's Plaid has a great push to be the Plaid for many places.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the key thing is what we need is a combination of people who have problems that need to be solved, end users, and developers and customers and startups who are actually trying to solve those problems. And so where we see fintech happening, it's that's where we want to get involved, and we want to play a role in seeding that as much as possible. And so where we can hopefully create community in new new cities or new countries where we're operating, that's a great opportunity. And really just trying to understand, like where is innovation either happening or needs to happen because people's expectations are just fundamentally too low when it comes to money. That draws our eye. So I think that's definitely international will continue to be a big focus and something that we spend a lot of time on. There's some other really interesting parts too that I'm excited about for Plaid. One is we launched something called Plaid Direct last year, which is there's a question about Plaid's relationships with banks and the complexity, and I think Plaid Direct's a really interesting story. Jesse is
and what is Plaid Direct?
Plaid Direct, yeah. So you should ask Jesse about it afterwards. But Plaid Direct is a way for banks to actually proactively opt into the Plaid network, and in that actually have a more of a bidirectional relationship with us. Historically, it's all been about how does Plaid get information from the bank, which is where it's siloed and trapped, out into the world on behalf of the consumer where it can actually be used for good. And Plaid Direct not only makes that process much, much better and allows smaller institutions to really, and like fintechs to launch on day zero as a support institution on Plaid, but it also allows us to start creating more value back for institutions and really like illustrating the value of what happens when an institution embraces and leans into financial technology and sees that as a feature of a bank account, right? And why you would choose to bank at this institution or that institution because it works really well with all of these services that you use, and how can we actually unlock and help those services in the bank work better together. And so thinking about how we can change that relationship and create more value not only for the consumers, fintechs that are on the network today, but also like bring institutions and reward their support for and embracing of financial technology is also pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. All relationships between all parties, consumers, banks, intermediaries are changing in new and exciting ways. Well, great. Thanks so much for previewing that. And I'd love to open the floor to a couple questions for Baker.
Yeah. So the question is kind of around like how do we see platforms changing and the influences that has on infrastructure. And I think a lot of the neobanks have really started to embrace like every aspect of it. You see them offering personal financial management for like, helping people with held away accounts. You see them using Plaid to help their consumers open up accounts much faster. Those are really core usual use cases, but you also see folks like Varo and Chime, Plaid Direct, like really embracing Plaid Direct and promoting, you should use us because we work well with all the applications that you know and trust and need in your financial life. And so I think those tend to be the ones that are using Plaid in its fullest today. But it's interesting because I don't think it's necessarily fair to say a customer's only using Plaid in full if they're using all of our products, because even if you're using just one, hopefully it's so critical to your business that even if you're just using transactions, hopefully it's adding the value that your entire business really depends on it, or your product really like unlocks differential value by using it. So we kind of, Zach talks about like snacking products versus feasting products, and our products tend to be feasting products because they're so integral to the core value proposition of what our customers are building. And that's good because it just really, really aligns us and our customers to solve problems together and get really close. So that's how it's a good situation.
We do have more appetizers, speaking of snacking and feasting, but let's maybe do one more question too.
How do you guys feel prioritizing access to more like retail consumer data
Yeah. So how do we prioritize access to data versus doing things on top of the network and on top of that data? Is that right?
Do you mean like access to business banking data and that sort of?
Oh yeah. Great question. So historically, the question is, consumer data versus small business SMBs. Historically, we focused on consumer, just because that was where a lot of our early customers are. In terms of building an audience and building trust in financial technology, was also really helpful. And having a big audience mattered early on. One of the biggest hesitations with Plaid in the beginning was like, who's ever going to actually connect their bank account, right? Like, it's no one's going to trust anybody with this information. They're not going to go through this experience. And so actually demonstrating at scale and seeing your friends using Venmo and everything working out all right and building trust and building familiarity with these services broadly was really useful. That's allowed us to then spend more time over time on small businesses because we tend to see they are, in terms of creating value, financial institutions, for example, like we want to incentivize them to embrace Plaid, right, and to embrace fintech, and they view small businesses as very important, very critical customers. And so our ability to become a big part of small businesses and unlock products that really, really help them, I think increases the value of fintech overall. It increases the importance of fintech overall in the eyes of banks and financial institutions that care about what that market and what that audience really thinks and their experience day to day. So we've now, and just by virtue of the size and scale of the company too, we have started to focus more on business accounts. So something that we're actively doing today, towards the last year, adding accounts for the business portals and things like that at Wells Fargo and at First Republic and things that we hadn't always supported, and now spending time on things like better identity data for small businesses, because we know those are vast audience there, and actually onboarding them, reaching them is very difficult. And so if we can help people do that, it's increasingly a priority. And we've got a bunch of good customers, like Pilot, like Brex, like others who focus on helping those sorts of customers, and being a good partner to them is important.
Yeah, there's a lot of data, consumer or otherwise, locked up in the world in financial products, and I think that at some point Plaid will unlock that data no matter where it lives. And so it sounds like small business is an interesting opportunity. Cool, well, great. Thanks so much, Baker, for coming out, and thanks everyone. Let's give Baker and Zach both another hand.